experience in these three very different but related presentations is that there's a good deal of science to support our public policy moving in this direction and the application of this science to both practice and policy. When I was at ACF, we had an all-in strategy, which was any piece of funding we had access to. We've moved it in this direction. Every authority we had to help states focus on these issues, we took every opportunity to give them the latitude to do that. And I think in the end, we're in a really important place, both in child welfare and in other public systems. And that place is not one of not knowing that this science exists, but instead a place of knowing how to apply it to the real world. And we hope that these presentations give you a couple of examples of how individuals have gone about integrating this really important scientific set of findings into public systems and into programs and practices. So it's a context, and we're at a really important point in that context. And our hope is that the rest of the time we have here, we can raise questions and have dialogue, not as much about the science, although we can go there, but much more about the application. And so with that, we'll take questions from the room and questions from folks who are participating online.
Much of the discussion so far has been about primary prevention strategies. Working in a child welfare environment, many of the youth and children that we tend to come in with problems already, with adverse effects. What strategies or what models would differ from what you've presented so far that we can apply to these children?
So I think it's a great question. Being the primary child welfare person up here, I'll take a stab at answering the child welfare question. I think that there are a couple of things to think about. In child welfare, one of the things to think about is all of the missed opportunities that exist in child welfare to facilitate healthy relationships and to build skills and competencies. When we remove a child from a bad environment, that's a very traumatic experience, but it's also an opportunity to help young people understand the presence of the challenges that they face, as well as to understand the context in which they're being introduced to a new caregiver or a different relative. So there are a whole bunch of opportunities in child welfare that are already intended to be developmentally and clinically, therapeutically oriented, and we miss the opportunity to do something. When we have child and family visits, that isn't just because that parent has a legal right to have access to their child. It's based on the premise that a regular interaction that is appropriately supported facilitates the healthy and ongoing relationship between the child and the parent. So there are a whole bunch of things in child welfare that we have immediate access to changing the way we practice and have an impact in this way, and we can give you a whole long list of those. I think the other part of what we've done here in child welfare is to recognize the impact of trauma, but not to say that trauma by itself is the problem, but instead to say that child trauma has specific impacts on a child's cognitive, physical, emotional, and social development. And so the reason why we ought to care about trauma is because our children become impaired in really critical ways in order to succeed. And so when we're intervening on trauma, it is not because we're trying to erase the experience that they've had in and of itself. It is specifically to address the impairment that comes as a result of that trauma. And so you take an example of an intervention like trauma-focused CBT for children who have been maltreated. And if you look at that intervention, there's some really positive set of findings that are emerged that say that it has a cross-cutting impact, that trauma-focused CBT both reduces anxiety, it reduces depression, it reduces a whole host of clinical and physiological responses to the trauma. So it's an example of an intervention that says that there are consequences and impairments, and trauma-focused CBT actually goes after those impairments. And there's a good deal of science that shows that it can reduce impairment across each of the major domains of well-being. So it's a really good example of child welfare, focusing on trauma, but recognizing that it really is having a physiological and neurological impact or impairment, and then using interventions and practices really to go after the impairment with the goal of moving that child back to a normal level of functioning in those key domains that are appropriate for their age and stage. So it's thinking about well-being not as simply being for or being against it, but recognizing that in each of those key domains, we can measure success, we can see where kids are struggling, and we can align our practices and our programs to really go after the impairment, which then moves a child back to normal functioning and development, which moves them towards positive outcomes.
If I may, let me add to that, that if you look inside the preventive interventions that have been developed, and in fact there are family interventions that have been developed from the prenatal period through adolescence. But if you look inside all of those, most of those were developed in clinical settings. They were developed for families where a kid is already having a lot of trouble. And so it turns out that if you can intervene early, you can prevent the development of those problems. So I think the very same techniques that are involved in helping parents to become more patient, to become more skilled in joining their child about what's going on, in positively reinforcing appropriate behavior, and especially in reducing the use of harsh and inconsistent discipline, that those are all valuable techniques. And then you have things like multidimensional foster family care, where a child may go into foster care and may go back into the family if the family's still intact and you can work with them, where you have good outcomes for kids who have multiple problems. So I think it's valuable to sort of get clear about the details of what happens when you work with families on these things. And the same thing I think can be said about schools, but I'm going to be quiet and Roger will probably talk about that.
Yeah, if I could weigh in on a few things here. Very often, social and emotional competence is a missing piece that's a part of all kinds of interventions. Somebody who's mentally healthy has an accurate awareness of themselves. They feel good about their capacities to accomplish things in realistic ways. They're good problem solvers. They know how to get along with others in group situations. A lot of work, if you had asked me 2 years ago in the field of social and emotional learning, where had we turned our attention? It was really, in the context of education, it was to the Common Core state standards. What are the capacities that kids need to achieve academically? But 2 weeks ago, we had a meeting with the U.S. Department of Education, and also we have a lot of meetings. There's an Office of Social and Emotional Learning now within the Chicago Public Schools. Two of the things that are prioritized are multi-tier systemic support and disciplinary disparities. Those connections are going to be critically important. So the question for me in this work, although much of the focus has been primary prevention or universal, how do you get a coordination between what would be called Tier 3 services, Tier 2 services, or universal programming, so that there is a synergy and there's not a disconnect between these things? So I think going back 30 years ago when I was doing randomized control trials and working on universal programming, there was a teacher who came up to me, and she was a special education teacher. She said, I would like my kids to have this program. And I said, well, we're doing this kind of with a universal focus right now. And she said, you don't think that kids in special education have social and emotional difficulties they need to learn how to handle better? And she convinced me. There's adaptations, obviously, in the work that need to be done, but one of the key questions for me is integration and a synergy across the services that are delivered to be effective.
Yeah, what was striking to me about the move that I made from child welfare to public education was that the same families we were struggling with in child welfare were the families that we were struggling with at the Chicago Public Schools. And there was a real sense that at the Chicago Public Schools that we didn't know enough to effectively intervene and move children back to better functioning. We had the classic problem at Chicago Public Schools in which 5% of the students represented over 50% of the student code of conduct violations, a relatively small group of young people who were really struggling with a limited response. But as Roger indicated, in developing a 3-tiered model where you're teaching those basic skills to everybody, and then you're being more targeted in your interventions as you move to a smaller and smaller group, we found that many of those young people who were the greatest challenge to the school system made a good deal of progress, and the principals typically wanted more access to the programs, not less. So it is not uncommon for children to be in multiple systems. In each of those systems struggle to serve them well. And I think the science of what we're talking about here has the potential for being integrated across multiple systems, and therefore children and families aren't experiencing one kind of approach in one system and a different approach in the other, but instead one that has greater continuity, and by doing so have a greater likelihood of having the impact that it was intended to have.
And there's a continuum, I think, from school and classroom management and compliance-oriented strategies to work with any kids, to relationally oriented approaches, to approaches that really focus on enhancing youth voice, social and emotional competencies, and promoting their self-discipline. And I think there needs to be a balance where a lot of the work that we do really focuses on enhancing competencies that kids have so they can successfully navigate their environments. There has to be more of a balance, I think, moving in that direction.
So one of the questions we got from online, I think it was an interesting one, which is that the question basically says everything the panelists said makes sense, but the question is, can each of you provide a provocative example of what one might do to really move this effort forward? So they're asking you to get rid of the boundaries and think about if you could be really aggressive in introducing an approach here that would move to a well-being frame, what would that provocative idea be?
Funny you should mention it. If this meeting were held 40 years ago, this room would be full of cigarette smoke. This society has changed with respect to a very common practice. The smoking rate's less than half what it was 40 years ago, and the culture has changed despite the fact that tobacco companies spent hundreds of millions of dollars to prevent that. I think that what we need is a cultural movement, a social movement that focuses on making, for a start, schools and families nurturing, all schools and all families, and that we need policies that leverage that, policies that require, first of all, that there's a surveillance system so we know what proportion of kids, not just the proportion of families where there's abuse, but what proportion of families are doing the things that are nurturing successful development. We can do that. We have the techniques for doing that. And then we need advocacy organizations to come together. I was talking earlier about the fact that there are organizations that are working on antisocial behavior. There are organizations working on academic success. There are ones working on tobacco use. There are other ones working on alcohol problems. But if all of these problems stem from the same problematic conditions, we could cut to the chase and really begin a social movement that brings everybody together around efforts to ensure that every family and every school is nurturing. Roger's, doing some wonderful work, and I think probably could tell us what the prevalence of schools are that are effectively promoting social and emotional behavior. Those are the kinds of things we need. But it needs to be a social movement. It needs to be a social movement because, how many people in this room think that there's enough money being spent on the treatment and prevention of the problems of children and adolescents? Why don't we have that money being expended? It's being expended in other countries because we don't have a social movement that is bringing everyone together around the values of ensuring that every child reach adulthood with the skills, interests, and health habits they need to live a productive life in caring relationships with other people. That is going to require a social movement. Is that provocative enough?
Roger, Barbara?
Well, in addition to that movement, let's operationalize it to reorganize how public systems are structured and what they're accountable for. So we thought we were slightly provocative by encouraging policies like ending the option for a young person to age out of a group setting, or to establish and to broaden the definition of Medicaid eligibility for medical necessity to include those who experience trauma. We thought those were provocative, but we can go many steps up to say, right now, the offices, to the extent that they exist around wellness, around social, emotional, and physical well-being, tend to be smaller under something else, and not empowered or resourced to be able to really change and move the dial on social, emotional, and physical well-being outcomes. So what if we reorganized, instead of a Department of Education and a Department of Child Welfare and a Department of Juvenile Justice and a Department of Health, to reorganize to around departments of wellness, to think about who's responsible for ensuring social development of families and children, who's responsible for ensuring the cognitive functioning. We may say and quibble that already exists, but how we might turn that upside down and reorganize and create the financial incentives and the accountability incentives so that we're not accountable for things that may not be as important in terms of outcomes, but things that we crystallize as incredibly important, which is the ability to maximize your intellectual potential, the ability to form and sustain relationships, the ability to be well.
Right.
And that might be a way to really move the dial, and it would take a social movement to be able to
Roger, you
make
want to
that
weigh
type
in?
of organization.
Very often when things like this come up, there are paradoxes that you can present. And I would say in 2007, Castle had a meeting, and Congressman George Miller came, and he was trying to reauthorize No Child Left Behind at that point. So this has gone on for 7 years, and we haven't made much progress, certainly in Congress. And what happened as a function of this is there have been waivers granted to certain states because they weren't going to be at 100% proficient performance and academic performance by the year 2014. So California has California core districts. These are districts that have split off from the state and have said, when we have an accountability system, we want it to be 60% academic, 20% climate and culture, and 20% social and emotional learning. So they're thinking about an accountability system that actually is emphasizing this work, which could be amazing and fantastic, or it could be terrible. And I think we have to be careful about unintended negative consequences of doing accountability assessment work in this area. Having said that, the other side of the paradox for me are what I would emphasize is ultimately, if there is a social movement in education, I think it's going to be led by students and by teachers. So how do we give them the voice, the support, so that they can address these things? We did a national survey of teachers who said social and emotional development of kids is critically important for their success academically, in terms of their career and college success and so on, and building a better climate in school. So I think on the ground, teachers know about this, students know about the importance. They need the support on up the line at the district level, the state level, the federal level, but how to have a movement that is led by the students and teachers, and to have faith that that's going to lead in a good direction, I think is something we need to see.
Other questions in the back?
As a social work graduate student, I'm struck by all of the information that you guys said today are things that we talk about in our first semester of graduate school. If you're sort of looking for a social movement, it's sort of like, we have two tables here. Like, I feel like we've been talking about this, so I'm happy that other disciplines are sort of joining us. And I want to say, if you're looking for change, like, here we are. We're in schools, we're in your agencies. We're not just caseworkers. We're clinical social workers. And in schools, I worked in a school in Englewood, and I was at Evanston High School, and I ran the restorative justice program. And it's changing culture. It's changing social and emotional well-being. And I think it's things like that that are doing things. So I just want to say, like, we're here. Like, don't forget about us.
Here.
So that wasn't really a question. I'm sorry. So here, let me ask a question. How do you guys utilize social workers in things that you do?
Well, there may be a variety of answers. I'll offer mine, kind of with a historical perspective and then a challenge. I was trained as a clinical psychologist, and originally most of the work that I did was with school social workers, psychologists, and counselors, and it was very much focused on early intervention, identifying kids who had problems and bringing services to those kids and trying to extend mental health reach in some way. And I think one of the challenges within the social work profession, where if you provide especially direct service and there are too many kids who have challenges, and you're never going to have enough resources. You know, if there are estimates in a school of 500 kids that in a disadvantaged community, maybe half of them may have, identified by teachers, have different kinds of adjustment problems. So how do you, if you're a social worker and you're working 2 days a week in a school, help all those kids who have services? And part of the challenge there has to do with how much direct service you do and how much systems work you do. So one of the things I would be curious about is in terms of the focus, the training that's happening, how do we get a balance of and it can be social workers, it can be psychologists, it can be counselors. How do you get a balance between what is done directly, sometimes in one-to-one or small groups, sometimes going into the classroom, a lot of social workers come in and do that, versus how to be kind of more systemic in focus and to create competence within systems to address these issues that I think social workers have a complete handle on how important it is. So the challenge of the balance is what I would wonder about going forward.
Yeah, I'd make 2 quick points. One is, and I think you hit the nail on the head in part, in child welfare, most of our social workers don't do social work, they do case management. Right? And case management, for those of you that don't work in child welfare, is not social work. It is playing the role of traffic cop. It is making sure that all of the things that are required to be done are done. And unfortunately, we know that's what happens, but as soon as we start talking about improving outcomes for young people, we immediately turn to the other side of our brain and say, well, the social workers should do that. Well, they can't do that if they also still have to do everything else that we give them. And so part of what we have to do in child welfare is ultimately come to a conclusion about what it is that we're asking of caseworkers. Are we asking them to do casework or social work? How do we strike a balance if that's what we want to achieve? And if we can't strike that balance, how do we build other supports into the system so that we can deliver the kind of support that's needed, even if it can't happen through a caseworker, because they've got lots of other things that they're responsible for. When I was in the Illinois Child Welfare Director, we realized that one of the things that we thought was really important was to have a more comprehensive picture of what our kids were struggling with, where they came from and the caregivers that were taking care of them. So we wanted to introduce an integrated assessment process. But we did that with the reality of knowing that if we just gave that to the caseworkers and said, here's one more thing you have to do, it simply wouldn't happen. And so we had to build new capacity within child welfare that complemented one another so that we could both do the casework that needs to be done and do the kind of in-depth screening and assessment that also needs to be done in order to get to a positive outcome, and then bring those two pieces together. And I can't say that we figured it out exactly perfect, but we recognized that the system was making unrealistic demands already. And if we wanted to do this other work, we had to add capacity. We couldn't just add it to the list of things that caseworkers needed to do. So that's point one, and I think most folks know where I'm coming from on that one. But I also think that we also have to be clear that while there are great social work programs across the country, most of those programs don't prepare young people for the really difficult work in really tough circumstances like child welfare. They show up with the basics, but the kind of ongoing support that social workers need to continue to improve their craft in a specific context is the other important element here. There was one study that just looked at interviewing clinicians who were doing work in child welfare, and the question was, can you name an evidence-based intervention? Not can you actually deliver one, but can you name one? It asked another question, which is, how do you make a decision about what service to provide a child? And it had two, I think, really profound findings. One was that the vast majority of the clinicians said that they decided what to do for kids based on the theories that they were taught in social work, not based on screening and assessment instruments that they were using in a really detailed way to make really critical, nuanced decisions about getting the child what they needed. Not a criticism of social workers as a profession, but a reflection of the ongoing need, even after you have that basic education, to have that skills development done in the context of the work itself. And so that was a really important finding. And then the other finding was just the limited understanding of what works. And that's in part a reflection of focusing on evidence-based interventions is a fairly recent phenomenon. The focus on randomized trials, as Tony indicated, it has ramped up over the last 30 years. And so we know more about what works. And unfortunately, that doesn't get into the field. And so this same study found that only about 10% of the programs that the respondents named had an evidence base to them. So it was a reflection of both their limited understanding of where the evidence base had evolved since they were educated, as well as a reflection of the fact that so little of the evidence base was available to them that it wasn't something that they interacted with every day. So they couldn't name the intervention because they didn't see it often enough to be able to say, I know it when I see it and I know that it's happening over there. So I think that's not a criticism of our social work programs. It's just a reality check about the issues that they confront, particularly in child welfare and increasingly in public education, the complexity of their context and the limited time that they have in an educational environment to learn all the things that you need to know in order to be really effective. And so I think that your points are really well taken. But if we're going to be serious about making sure that our workforce have what they need, we need to be clear about what we're asking them to do. And then in context, we need to make sure that they have the skills and information they need to make the best decisions possible. So I think I probably should be quiet. We've got about another 10 minutes, so we got a little bit more time for questions. So next question.
Good morning. My name is Esther Chamarela. I'm the director of the Chicago Hispanic Health Coalition and the coordinator of Federal Qualified Health Center. You hear, no?
Yep. Just have to hold it closer to your mouth.
Okay.
There you go. You got it now.
My name is Esther Chamarela. I'm the director of the Chicago Hispanic Health Coalition and a coordinator of Federal Qualified Health Center. I think it has been mentioned the importance to start early in how we engage consumer. My fundamental thing with women's health is to start early in the intervention. I think it's nothing new. But when we're talking about managed care or health care, we don't see the people go and see the doctor and that's it, and we don't connect it with, for parents, with pediatrician and OB or other, providers at that moment is to start early to engage consumer and how to deal with child well before they start the school system. And it's no system in the Medicare, or we'll see in the Obamacare will be changes where the education on parenting, we involve more consumer on prevention. And I think it's a comment. And how much we need to start. I see that every day. The parents go to see the children and the doctor for immunization, but this connection with how they need to deal with children before they born, so that's my point.
So one of the questions we received online was a question about examples of screening and assessment instruments that can be helpful in the area of assessing well-being as well as promoting progress. So anybody think of screening and assessment instruments that immediately come to mind?
The Annie Casey Foundation, one of our members, is actually in the process of piloting a new behavioral health assessment tool for youth in care. And that tool is unique in a couple of different ways, that it allows a caseworker to see not only the progress of that young person once a problem is identified that you want to provide treatment for, but also enables you to assess the efficacy of the provider. They found that some mental health providers were really good in treating depression, for example. And any child that they sent presenting with depression as an issue got better. But if they sent a child with anxiety to that particular practitioner, that child did not get better. So it's a new tool to really enable the caseworker to see, of the available practitioners in my community, how do I better match what the issue is with what that particular practitioner is good at. And you wouldn't expect that all practitioners are incredibly great at treating a whole host of different types of things, but to better match the particular issue with the strength of the provider. And that's a exciting new health assessment tool that I think is still in the pilot phase, but has great promise for better connecting the issue that we're trying to deal with and the strengths of a mental health practitioner.
Yeah. Roger, you?
Well, if I could say a couple of things about principles of screening, and also offer maybe some suggestions of tools. One of the things, Brian, that you just said is if you're going to do systematic screening, it should be related to treatment decisions or intervention decisions. And all too often, screening assessments are used for categorization maybe of children, but not necessarily for treatment strategies. So sometimes with screening, there can be iatrogenic effects, I think, if you identify kids and say these kids have problems, but you don't bring effective services right away, then it may be worse than having no screening at all.
Great point.
The second thing is very often these instruments are pathology and deficit oriented, and it creates a mindset when people look at this at the child, well, I see acting out or peer relationship problems or poor motivation to achieve. And a long time ago when we began to do screening and we identified problem behaviors, in terms of intervention strategies, we would ask, well, what's the kid do right? What are the strengths?
Great.
So now there are screening tools on the one hand that look at problem behaviors. There's something called the AML rating scale as one that kind of looks at, with norms, prevalence of acting out or shy, anxious, or learning difficulty behavior. But at the same time, there are tools. The DESA is one, the Devereux Elementary Student Strengths Assessment, and they have something even called the mini DESA. It's 8 items, but it helps to frame thinking in a competence perspective rather than thinking in a pathology perspective. And the other thing that I think is happening increasingly, which is important in the field, is to look at environmental and relational kinds of components in this, not just to be child-focused and pathology-oriented, but one revolution is to be strength-oriented, the next one is to be context-oriented, and the final thing is to connect the screening and assessment to what the intervention strategies are going to be.
Great point. Tony?
Yeah, I want to bring this back to public health. It's just a natural thing in society that we have evolved treatment procedures. People are sick and we're trying to make them better. People are having behavioral problems, we're trying to intervene with those. And it takes something to sort of back up and say, well, ultimately, aren't we concerned with the well-being of the entire population? And I think that, because the existing organizations are ones that have really evolved to treat and to deal with problems that are occurring, child welfare being one example, there's a lot less in the way of resources being put to prevention. And this sort of comes to mind as we're talking about the issue of screening, because I think of the state of Oregon, for example, where under the leadership of Governor Kitzhaber, who is a physician, they have really begun to transform not only healthcare, but what we're doing with young children. They created an early learning council, which is getting every county in Oregon to assess the readiness of every kindergarten child coming into kindergarten. They're using the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire and an instrument called the Easy CBM, which is a good predictor of kids' cognitive and reading development, reading being really essential. But once you start to do that, you kind of have a chart on the wall in every community that shows the proportion of kids who are ready. And we know in high poverty neighborhoods that we're working in Lane County, where I live, that about 50% of the kids are not ready. Well, what does that say? That says that the community needs to back up and start to do more to reach out to families prenatally and in infancy. We provide the nurse-family partnership to maybe half of the mothers that could benefit from it because we just don't have the resources. So I guess what I'm saying is that we really need to put more resources into affecting the entire population through the kinds of interventions that have been shown to work. Now, the other thing is, I've said there are all these interventions that have been shown to work in randomized trials and so on. But the fact of the matter is that we still don't have the science that we need on how to reliably get those implemented. That's where much of the prevention research is turned to, how do we reliably get this implemented? We're making progress on that. But ultimately, I think we need to take a population perspective.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the interesting, challenges both in child welfare as well as in public schools is often the role that the DSM plays in a decision about which children need help and which ones don't, right? That in effect, you almost have to document an adult mental illness in order to provide help to children. And one of the real downsides to that is that it fails to recognize that children who may be struggle across a continuum. It's not as if they either have a problem or they don't. And as soon as you have the screen that says they don't have the diagnosis or you have the screen that says they do, that the work is over, right? And so I think particularly as we think about the emergence of mental health problems in adolescence, the reference that Tony made to the IOM report really did make the case for taking a different approach to screening and assessment so that it was less about whether a child did or didn't have a diagnosis, but where they were at from a competency standpoint and the extent to which there were impairments, so that one could begin to think about actually preventing mental illness by early intervention. And so that really requires us to rethink the way we use the DSM and the way we use screening and assessment, and instead to really think about it from a competency standpoint and think about it from an impairment standpoint, so that we can say developmentally, where do we need children to be and how do we intervene in ways that don't require that a child have a diagnosis before we intervene. And that's a real struggle, both in child welfare and in public education. But I think if we can get smarter about framing our goals around well-being, I think we will then have to turn to different screening and assessment approaches so that we identify where children are at and build from where they're at, rather than wait for them to have a diagnosis and only then choose to intervene. And so I'd just like to close today by going back to where we started this morning, which is to say that the role of Chapin Hall in the world, its mission, is to promote the well-being of children through the use of science and in changing policy. And so for me, the conversation that we just begun here is not a single conversation, but instead this is about reaffirming the mission of Chapin Hall and bringing a greater focus on how public systems can use public resources to promote well-being. So stay engaged, continue to follow Chapin Hall, and know that this is an area of work that if you're interested in it, know that we're interested in it, and let's seek out opportunities to collaborate, because we think fundamentally, if we want the best outcomes for the families that struggle the most, then we can't afford to continue to piecemeal the way we intervene and support those families, and instead we have to have a whole child, whole family approach that is intended to promote the well-being of children. So with that, thanks for coming out, and we'll see you down the road.